Hello everyone! Today I'm going to evaluate one of the most notable geopolitical tension in history, a conflict between two major superpowers which didn't involve actual fighting, the Cold War. Though the Cold War did not have a necessary time frame to when it begins, we tacitly believe that all of it roughly begins at the end of World War II, where disintegration between the relations of Soviet Union and United States occurred. During World War II, Soviet Union, United States and their allies had a brief cooperation. It all began with Britain and Soviet Union coming together as a formal alliance, which was later joined by the United States after the bombing of Pearl Harbor on 1941. Many programs, including the Lend-Lease policy, which was included as one of the strategies to defeat Germany, supported the cooperation. Through the Lend-Lease program, the US mass-distributed all kinds of goods from necessities to weaponry, all in the hopes to aid their allies including Soviet Union. However, it is quite predictable that both sides encounter lots of disagreement throughout the cooperation process. Aside from that, a number of assumptions would also fuel the mistrust between both sides. Soviet Union presumed that the US and its allies delayed their second front against Germany, so that they can release their armies at the last minute of the battle and staging it as to influence the peace agreement and adjust their position to become more dominant in the Europe. The US in turn had assumed that the Soviets intentionally delayed the supply of uprising in Warsaw and refused to allow airdrops from the Americans and the British. Overall, both sides clearly have shown a lot of similarity in terms of military strategy, security, and everything in between. The undeniable lack of connection also fell in line with the mistrust that these two holds against each other. The World War II had benefited United States as they play a huge role in the production and distribution of weaponry during the war period. Moreover, as their productivity increases after the war, the US was held accountable for 50% of the world's economic production, while having 5% of the world population. Their industries were intact, unlike other countries who served as pawns and held significant roles during the Second World War. Their major transition from military factories to civilian uses are in fact the reason why they are the true powerhouse of the world's economy. The successes of USA's economic regulations and policy proved that by employing their economic and a political approach, the countries that had suffered after the war would recover slowly but surely. Moreover, their reputation as the powerhouse of the economy aided their attempts to further the spread of their capitalism convictions. The US, as one of the major powers who was left unscathed after the war, might see this as an opportunity to convey the capitalism ideas that they hold so dearly to the rest of the world, and perhaps to countries that were so devastated by the war and are currently in a fragile position to rebuild their countries from the ruin of the Second World War. Their clear presentation of how an economy should be has successfully persuaded half of the world to adopt this holistic approach of free markets and profit-making industry. In the end, their firm belief on capitalism was then resulted in an estrangement with another superpower that holds the opposite ideology. A lot of people disputed that USSR had won the war, though it cost them a lot in return. Approximately 25 to 30 million souls perished, and many cities were left in total devastation of dehumanized actions such as what happened in Kiev. Despite of that, USSR had managed to occupy the eastern and central area of Europe as the World War II was coming to an end, while the other Western allies remained settled in the western part of Europe. Stalin, who was still in power when all of this happened, continued to spread out the sphere of influence in the USSR-occupied parts of the Europe, while simultaneously transforming themselves into a communist regime. Countries that were invaded by the Red Army of the Soviets were also dragged and converted into communist regimes. USSR had emerged as one of the most prominent powers adjacent to the US. The way they rebuilt themselves after being shattered by the impact of World War II, following with their conversion into a communist regime afterwards, had intrigued the world to take a closer look of how they control their economy and the way they maneuver around their politics. Their development in science, technology, and military strength were also attributable to its rise over the post-war period. However, having contradictory views towards economy and governance made the USSR become the long-standing opposition of the US. Communism is certainly and will never be in the dictionary of the Americans, while the USSR values the particular framework and they certainly function under it. The influence that the USSR had over their occupying countries are undoubtedly powerful, as evidenced by the way these countries withhold the temptation of liberty and free economy. Nonetheless, these occupying countries, who were also affected by the war, still managed to thrive under the communist hegemony. The competition that occurs in the Cold War are intended to maintain hegemony in various regions by upholding the ideology between two sides, socialism, communism by the Soviet Union, and liberalism and capitalism by the United States. Both parties are relentless in terms of spreading the utility of their system. This conflict occurred solely because of the collision of beliefs and by no means an act of vengeance or because of past issues, even though the Soviet Union had conveyed a sense of mistrust over the opposite bloc. Capitalist ideology glorifies individual freedom. It allows capitalism to utilize resources under the free will of its people. In contrast, the communist ideology believes that the government should control the resources and therefore wealth will be evenly distributed towards the people. This understanding promised to further accelerate the welfare of laborers and prevent companies from abusing its power to extract benefits from people. The United States further strengthened its influence and sought to spread capitalism by providing economic and military assistance to countries that were destroyed by the World War II, such as Turkey and Greece. The aim is to prevent the countries to fall into the hands of the communists. As a country with a privileged economy, the United States also provided assistance to the countries in the European region and Asia. To diminish communist influence, the United States and the countries that joined the Western Bloc had established a joint military defense pact in 1949 called NATO, or North Atlantic Treaty Organization. As a response to the invention of NATO, the Soviet Union then established a defense pact, the Warsaw Pact, whose members consisted of the Soviet Union, Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, and Romania. Along with the dominance rivalry between the two superpowers, the political situation in the world are yet again tensed and provoked mutual suspicion between the two sides, which is famously referred as the Cold War. When the term war crossed our minds, we will instantly picture a series of shooting action, invasion of the opponent's territory, aircraft battling against each other, and so on. However, the term Cold War is a little bit different compared to the usual definition of war that we have studied. Cold War itself does not involve any actual fighting. The term is better to be perceived by envisioning a hostile atmosphere between two superpowers with different views, each of them forming an alliance which could possibly serve as their combatants later in proxy wars, and an intention of dominating the world. The term Cold War was first coined by Bernard Baruch, the president's advisor as well as the leading businessman in the US. "Let us not be deceived," Baruch said. "We are today in the midst of a Cold War. Our enemies are to be found abroad and at home. Let us never forget this. Our unrest is the heart of their success." The phrase eventually caught on, and a lot of journalists began to refer this period of tension with the term Cold War, and included it on dozens of articles and newspapers across the world. Cold War itself is often associated with a lot of economic and political course of action. Such actions included propaganda, act of espionage, and the most dominant of all, proxy wars. proxy war is defined as a war which takes place amongst the satellite states, often to serve the best interests of another powerful countries. The countries behind these wars are often seen as the puppet master that has different agenda, but mainly to sustain their influence on the occupying country. The most popular notion about proxy wars is that the countries who indulged on these wars usually has a fifth column who acts on behalf of the supporting nation to undermine the aversive power from within. Other nations that serves as an indirect actor to the actual conflict usually supports the conflicting countries by advocating the rebel force, guerrilla movements, or even terrorist organizations in order to get in the opposing country's nerves. Under this particular sphere, proxy wars were mainly instigated because the US and the Soviet Union wants to consolidate their perceived hegemony while trying to spread its influence and disrupt each other's hegemony at the same time. Proxy war has become common since the end of World War II, and especially during the period of the Cold War. The latter was emphasized, particularly because people thought that there would be a major confrontation after a long-standing tension between the US and the Soviet Union, which could have resulted in a major nuclear holocaust as both countries possessed the capabilities of launching it. It might come off as quite relieving that these countries did not end up in catastrophic confrontation, though that doesn't mean that they didn't engage in any duel at all, hence the existence of these proxy wars. The Vietnam War was one of the several conflicts that could be considered as a proxy war during the Cold War period between the United States and its allies against the Soviet Union and its allies. The two warring camps are the Republic of Vietnam, or South Vietnam, and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, or North Vietnam. This notorious war occurred between 1957 and 1975 in Vietnam. As this war was part of the Cold War, both sides were supported by each superpowers. South Vietnam was supported by the United States, South Korea, Thailand, Australia, New Zealand, and the Philippines, while the North Vietnam, which was a communist country, was supported by the USSR and China. This war took a toll on the death rate of both sides. The estimated number of the victims are more than 280,000 on South Vietnam and more than 1 million on North Vietnam. The war resulted in a massive dispersion of Vietnamese citizens to other countries, notably the United States, Australia, and other Western countries, so that in those countries a large Vietnamese community could be found. After the end of this war, the two sides are then united in 1976. After the Vietnam War ended, a meeting between two different Vietnamese visions was agreed to unite to form a state in 1976. Although communist ideology from the Soviet Union became a national ideology, until now there are still many people from the southern Vietnamese region who did not use the communist ideology, and there is still ongoing resistance from some of the people of southern Vietnam. The Cuban Missile Crisis is a crisis that occurred between 1962, which occurred as a result of the Cold War that occurred between the United States and the Soviet Union. This crisis came about after the fact that the United States had backed an attack on Cuba's Bay of Pigs, a communist state in the Caribbean Sea. Despite the failure, this invasion has angered the Soviet Union, as the world communist leader as well as the people of Cuba itself. In September 1962, Nikita Khrushchev, Prime Minister of the Soviet Union, told US President John F. Kennedy that any subsequent attacks that is placed and aimed on Cuba would not be considered as an act of war. Not long after, the Soviet Union immediately placed medium-sized missiles equipped with nuclear warheads in Cuba. The missiles threatened the US because of its destructive ability that can destroy a large city in a short time after launch. On October 22, 1962, Kennedy appeared in public and demanded the Soviet Union to withdraw its missiles or the US would attack Cuba. So began the weeks known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. This confrontation may have been the closest that it gets for the US and the Soviet Union to actually engage in a nuclear war. The world perceived the Cold War as a significant chapter in the history of world affairs. The fact that a conflict between two nations has the ability to drag almost everyone on the list made it a huge reason why everyone, especially historians, continuously tries to examine the gravity that pulled every nation together. Even though we're clearly relieved that another hot war between two of the most powerful nations did not actually commence, but we are aware that instead, it brought a lot of its satellites to clash with one another. The antagonists in the Cold War were the United States and the Soviet Union. However, the Cold War had an indirect impact on every country around the world, and in certain aspects, as it momentarily divides the world into two different sides. The countries where the proxy wars occurs usually gets nothing but adverse effects. These countries sacrifice their buildings and infrastructure and peace on behalf of their puppet master. In other countries, the impact is more positive. The United States and the Soviet Union competed to help the countries that did not choose both sides. They compete to provide economic assistance to these countries to convince them to choose one party. In a sense, countries that do not side with the two antagonistic countries benefit from the economic side. In the end, we can conclude that all countries incurred the magnitude of Cold War, and also that the Cold War indirectly formed international orders. Numerous questions have risen under the topic of Cold War, but perhaps the most controversial argument amongst historians was who was to blame for the Cold War? Of course, before developing our own theories and pinpointing the culprit, we have to have some retrospective insight from those who experienced the magnitude of Cold War firsthand, or at least from a perspective that exists near the time frame. In this video, we will examine 3 different schools of thoughts that were prominent on Cold War historiography, and they are the orthodox, revisionist, and post-revisionist. The Orthodox presumed that the answer to the question of who started the Cold War was simple: Stalin and the Soviet Union. At the end of the World War II, the US was very passive, while the Soviets were aggressive and expansive. The US was then slowly awakened by what they assumed was the Soviet threat. This argument was evidenced by an immediate proposal from the US to form the United Nations. The Soviet Union did not take the United Nations very seriously because they wanted to expand and maintain itself in its hegemony in Eastern Europe. After the war, the US withdrew its troops while the Soviet Union left large numbers of troops in Eastern Europe. The US recognized the interests of the Soviet Union, for example when Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill met in February 1945 in Yalta. America went out of their way to accommodate the Soviet interests. Stalin, however, did not fulfill their agreement, especially by not allowing free elections in Poland. Soviet expansionism was also confirmed when the Soviets were slow in withdrawing troops from northern Iran after the war. Only by the pressure from United Nations, the Soviets had finally agreed to pull their troops out from the area. In 1948, under the influence of the Soviet, Czechoslovakia communists took over the government. Also, the Soviet Union blocked Berlin in 1948 and 1949, trying to pressure the Western government to leave. According to the Orthodox, this event gradually awakened the United States from the threat of Soviet expansion, and which then provoked the Cold War. Revisionists believe that the Cold War was caused by Americans rather than Soviet expansionism. The proof is that at the end of World War II, the world was not really bipolar. The Soviets were far weaker than the US. The Soviet loss of up to 30 million people and industrial production was only half of the level of 1939. Stalin to the American ambassador, Averell Harriman, in October 1945 said that the Soviets would turn inward to repair domestic damage. Moreover, revisionists were convinced that Stalin's external behavior in the early post-war period was quite moderate. For example, in China, Stalin tried to preserve the communism influence through Mao Zedong rather than trying to be in power. Revisionist perspectives were drilled by the idea that the US principles of democracy and self-determination was merely an embellishment to their success story. Rather, it was driven by economic considerations and self-interest. In doing so, they banned the existence of Soviet communism to help them achieve a free market in Europe that were able to trade with them and receive their exports. This was evidenced by the proposal of Lend-Lease policy, the post-war loans facility, and the famous Marshall Plan. This argument gained even more recognition, especially when questions about America's foreign policy arise after the frustration in Vietnam. Post-revisionism emerged in the late 1970s and 1980s and was advocated by John Lewis Gaddis, who had an alternative argument. This school of thought looks at the justification of both orthodox and revisionist. Then it simply arrives to the conclusion that the two were inexact. The reason behind this was because they believed that no one is to blame for as the culprit of the Cold War. The countries were left in a fragile state after World War II, thus making the structure of power unbalanced. However, only two superpowers remained: United States and Soviet Union. The post-revisionist movements are heavily based upon existing research, but what is more striking is that this movement leaned a little bit towards to the orthodox, as it implicitly assumes that the Soviet Union was slightly more responsible of Cold War, hence making the revisionists refer to it as the new orthodoxy. Since this school of thought embraced a vast amount of perspectives, it is worth mentioning that most of them also argues that Stalin was an opportunist and a pragmatist. Rather than an aggressive revolutionary, would go to great lengths for expanding communism. They also agreed that American foreign policy is overextended and that it was mostly exerted under economic considerations. I hope you enjoyed the video and thank you so much for watching.